In this video, we're going to discuss how to edit and sequence MIDI notes from the Atom controller. So what we'll do is first record a simple MIDI sequence, and then using the controls in the Atom, we're going to show you how to edit that sequence. So inside of the software, I have an instance of the MyTi synthesizer loaded up with just the initialized preset, and it just sounds like this. And then let's go ahead and record a simple chord pattern into our sequencer. I'm just going to go ahead and turn on the click track that happens before I start recording a sequence. So right now these notes are out of time, but that's okay because I'll show you how to adjust that within the sequencer of Studio One. So to show the MIDI note editor for the selected clip, you can go over to the left-hand side of the controller and press the editor button. And then you'll see that MIDI clip editor pop up on the bottom of the screen. And we can just press the stop button to get the cursor back to the beginning, so that the playback head is at the beginning of our project. And then if you want to zoom in and out of the editor, so we can see our entire recorded sequence, so it just fills the window, press the zoom button and then the left or right buttons, and it will zoom in and out of the area. So we can zoom out or we can zoom in. Just go over about that. And we could zoom into about there. If you want to zoom in vertically, you can press the zoom button and then the up or down controls, and it will make the notes larger or smaller. So for that, we can just go ahead and make it just a little bit bigger here. Maybe something about like that. And then now we can move on to selecting the notes. So when you're inside of the editor, you can use the left and right buttons to select the individual vents. So I can just use these two commands to move right and left. So we can start off on the first note, and we can move to the right. So jump up to the next note, which is the next in our note sequence. And it will scroll through those various different notes. Or if I wanted to select multiple note events at the same time, so say for example, I wanted to select this last chord, I can hold the shift button and then use the left or right selection controls to select both events. So we can move one to the left, and then now I've selected both notes within that chord. So let's go ahead and select all the notes in our sequence. So just go ahead and move over to the left. So now that we've zoomed into our sequence, you can see that the start times of my MIDI notes were off the beat. So this first section fell slightly behind. And then this next one started just a little bit behind the bar. And what we can do is we can quantize everything from the controller so that it starts at the beginning of those beats. So now that we have all of our notes selected, what we can do is press the shift and then the nudge button, which is marked quantize on the kind of subscript on the button. And it'll quantize everything within our sequencer. So now if we look in our sequencer, it snapped everything to the closest MIDI note value. So it snapped this one to the beginning of the bar, but because these notes were a bit closer to this next downbeat, it snapped them to this next downbeat over here. And this snap value is controlled by the quantize that you set within this value right here. So if I wanted to snap to something a bit larger, I could change that value and you see that the grid spacing has changed. Or if I wanted to move by something a bit finer, let's say a 16th note, for example, now we have more spaces on the MIDI grid. So this set of notes is now snapped to the grid, but as you may have noticed, they're starting a little bit behind that beat. So if we want to go ahead and move these, we could either do so inside of the software sequencer just by clicking on notes and shifting them around, but you can also control the position of notes from the Atom controller without ever having to touch the software. And that's based on the nudge control. So what I want to do is just select these first two notes. So we can go over to the left and then hold the shift button and move over to the right. So now we have that first chord sequence selected, and then I can hold my nudge button and move everything over to the left. And you'll see that it's now shifting its position inside of the sequencer. If I wanted to shift those notes back to where they were initially, I could press the nudge button and then press the right. And this works for any MIDI note that you have inside of your sequencer. If I wanted to adjust how much these were shifted by the nudge feature, I can go up to the quantize button and adjust this so that it would change how those are spaced within the grid. So if I wanted to move everything by half a bar, for example, I could go over to my nudge button and move everything over to the right, and you could see that everything snaps over by 1/2 of a bar. And we could just go ahead and undo that by hitting the shift and undo button, which is the stop button. And let's go ahead and change that back to a 16th note. The next control that I want to talk about is how to move notes up and down within the MIDI note sequencer. So let's just go ahead and select the top note, which in our case is a G note. Just move over to the right-hand side, or the left. There we go. So now we have that first note selected. And then if I want to move this up or down, I can use the up and down arrows to move it up or down. So let's say we wanted to move that up 5 semitones. We could just press this 5 times. And now let's move that up to a C note. So whenever I play that back inside of my MIDI note sequencer, and actually we can turn off the click here. So we can just play that back. We've adjusted our chord pattern. And if we wanted to move everything back down, we can just use the down arrow and move it back down 5 semitones. Back down to a G note. If you want to move a sequence up or down an octave, you can press the Shift button and then the up to move everything up an octave, or Shift and down to move everything down an octave. So let's go ahead and just select our whole sequence. So let's go ahead and just move over to the left. So we start off on that first note, and then move everything over to the right. And I can press my Shift and up, and everything moves up an octave. Or I can move everything down an octave. Or I can also undo those changes that I've made. So by combining all these different controls in the MIDI note sequencer together, you can record and then edit patterns on the Atom without ever having to touch the software, which is one of the strengths of this controller. Is it allows for lots of customization and control options that let you control parts of Studio One, but to do it all from the actual controller itself rather than having to use a mouse. So when the editor menu is enabled, there's 4 additional controls on pads 9 through 12 that let you adjust your MIDI note sequences, and these are the pads that are illuminated in yellow. The first pad, pad 9, duplicates the selected note or groups of notes. So down in the sequencer, I have the G note selected, and then what I can do is just press duplicate, and then it's going to duplicate that note and move it over to the next section. And then if I wanted to move that note up to another note, let's say for example a C note, I can just press the up button, and then now I have a new chord that I've created by just duplicating that note. So this is a great way to create more complicated note patterns or more complicated chord patterns. It's just duplicating notes and then moving them around. The next button is the delete button. Whenever this is pressed, the selected note will be deleted. So I can just go to that C note and delete that. And this works for any of the selected notes, so you could select multiple notes at the same time and then delete them if you wanted to. So let's select these last 2 notes. And then I could delete both at the same time if I wanted to. Or I could just undo that motion. And then the final 2 controls in this section are the velocity plus and velocity minus. These controls let you reduce or increase the velocity of the selected notes inside of the sequencer. So to demo this, let's go ahead and select all the notes at the same time, and let's just use one of the macros on the song setup mode. So let's just switch over to the song setup mode and press pad number 2, which is one of the macros inside Studio One that's configured on this pad mode that will select all the notes in the note sequencer, so it could just save a bit of time. So what we can do is move over to this first note here. So let's go to the left. Actually, let's just choose both the notes in this chord. So we'll press Shift and left again. So we selected this entire chord. And then I can either press the velocity plus button and it will increase the velocity, which if you pay attention down here, you can see the velocity is increased, or I can press the velocity minus button and it will reduce the velocity of those notes. So this is with the reduced velocity. So we have more of the filter closed, or I could open it up by increasing the velocity. So you can see that we can change the overall character of our notes by just adjusting the velocity on this menu. And you want to keep in mind as well, for the specific patch on the MaiTai, the filter's cutoff frequency amount is applied to the velocity. So that's why the sound is changing a lot, and we get a lot more high frequencies whenever we have a higher velocity. And this velocity mode works for all the controls at the same time. So if I wanted to move over and select all my notes at the same time, I could just press pad number 2 in the song setup menu, which is one of those macro controls that we can configure from the Atom controller. So if we just go over to this editing menu, that's one of these controls here. That's the select all is on pad number 2. And you could always change that if you'd like. It's just defaulted to the select all inside the sequencer, which I find is pretty helpful. Go back and select all the notes. And then we can go back to our event editor, and we can reduce the velocity of all those notes at the same time, or we can increase the velocity of all those notes at the same time. And you can see that that's changing down here inside of the note sequencer. So this enables us to switch the velocity of all the notes at the same time to change up the overall feel of our chord pattern.